right, it's 5:30. Thank you all for coming today. I'm the outreach librarian at the Alaska State Library, and we're so happy to have Nina Chordas with us today. Before we start, I just want to say that if you're enjoying presentations like this and the first Folio exhibit, we'd love it if you would take a minute and fill out our survey. It's part of the requirements of the grant, and we haven't had very many responses yet, so you can get the link back on the back table with Freya. And tonight we're having Nina talk about Hamlet, which is the presentation that Theater in the Rough is going to do tonight at 7 out in our atrium. So Nina received her PhD in English from the University of Oregon, specializing in literature of the Renaissance. She currently serves as Associate Professor of English at UAS, where she has taught since 2002. Having grown up in a Russian-speaking family, she's also interested in Russian and Soviet scholarship on Shakespeare and the Renaissance. Nina was one of our supporting Shakespeare scholars for applying for this grant, and we really are grateful for her support, both with that process and tonight. And can I just mention to the other OWL libraries, if you could hit mute on your remote so that we don't get any background noise from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out here. I'd like to also thank the State Library for hosting this, and Theater in the Rough for doing these readings. Back in Shakespeare's time, people went to hear a play, not see it. It was much more of an audio culture, and in a way we're getting to hear the plays thanks to the readings and all the participants from the community. It's really great. So I'm going to be talking about Hamlet. There's so much to say about Hamlet that it's almost hard to know where to start. And so I just have a series of slides that kind of go through roughly the trajectory of the action, and I'll say a few things about them. I could have said other things. I just picked things I thought maybe would be interesting. As you probably have heard, I know Jim Hale did a talk on the Folio version. Although this is called Shakespeare's Hamlet, it probably wasn't Shakespeare's Hamlet from the moment he sold the script to the company, because once a manuscript leaves your hands, it becomes people can do things to it. You probably heard there are 3 extant versions of Hamlet. There's the first quarto, which is the bad quarto. And then there's the second quarto, which is the good quarto. And then there is the Folio. First quarto is 1603, second quarto 1604, and of course the Folio version was published in 1623 under the auspices of Shakespeare's fellow actors, Hemming and Condell. So Hamlet is the longest of Shakespeare's plays. There are about 200 lines in the second quarto that don't appear in the Folio edition, and about roughly 80 or so lines in the Folio edition that aren't in the second quarto. So a lot of times editors will combine the two. And so there may be different versions of Hamlet that you have actually seen performed or heard. So Hamlet opens with the ghost. I'm assuming most of you kind of know what the story is, but basically Hamlet's father's ghost appears and informs Hamlet that he's been murdered by his uncle, who has since married Hamlet's mother, and encourages Hamlet to take revenge. And the rest of the play is kind of focuses on Hamlet's attempt to carry out this directive. He has to figure out whether the ghost is an honest ghost, as he finally concludes, and has told him the truth, or whether it's a demon come from the other world to tempt him into a snare. And so Hamlet contemplates taking revenge on his uncle throughout most of the whole play, I guess. I just wanted to say there is a species of Renaissance tragedy that sometimes gets called revenge tragedy, and Hamlet falls into this category. It's a modern category, not one that they probably thought about back in Shakespeare's day. But there are several characteristics of the revenge tragedy that fit Hamlet really well. First of all, the revenger, unlike classical tragedy where you have a high figure and you're looking at the fall of someone from a high place, in the revenge tragedy, the hero often is powerless, is not in a position of power. The revenger is caught in a situation that is not of his making. He finds himself enmeshed in something that got started without his knowledge or participation, and as Hamlet says, alas, that I'm the one who has to set it right. He's the one who has to carry out the right thing and take revenge. Typically, the revenger has to seek satisfaction outside the law, outside the courts. He has to take it upon himself. It's always a he. I don't know if there's any with women, but women figure in them, but they're usually the victim or collateral damage. But the other thing is the revenger typically sets up a trap in order to ensnare the victim, which happens in Hamlet, in the play within the play that Hamlet sets up. The other thing about revenge tragedy is extremely bloody. It has a very high body count. And Hamlet, of course, fits this description as well. So as the play opens on the ramparts, we get a sense from the conversation, and then of course from what the ghost tells Hamlet, that all is not well in Denmark. There's a sense of foreboding. There are mysterious preparations. We learn that Fortinbras is coming from Norway. It's his father lost some land to Hamlet's father. There's all that kind of political intrigue going on. The first scene of Hamlet, too, is a really good example of how Shakespeare uses dialogue to set the stage for whatever's happening. Because we're used to watching plays in the dark with lighting. Lighting is a feature of the plays we see. We have an Oscar for it for movies. But in Shakespeare's day, of course, there was no such thing. Lighting was not a feature of the play. So if it was being performed outdoors, as in the Globe, where you had an outdoor stage, you were in broad daylight. If it was inside a hall, you had maybe candlelight or torchlight, but it was an even light. There was no darkening, or there's no spotlights, nothing of the sort. So the dialogue has to tell the audience what's going on. And this happens in the very first scene in Hamlet. Who's there is the first line spoken. This tells the audience in broad daylight that the actors can't see each other. And if you're aware of these nuances, you can kind of be aware as the play goes on of the different ways in which the scene is set through dialogue. And again, it's kind of a good opportunity as we're hearing these plays and not really seeing them perform for us to be attuned to such things. Okay. This is Hamlet with his mother Gertrude and his uncle Claudius. So we know by this point that Claudius has murdered Hamlet's father and usurped the throne. The marriage between Claudius and Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, was hasty. In fact, Claudius's whole speech talks about how hasty it was and how unseemly it was, but he talks about mirth and funeral and all these oxymorons to sort of try to explain it. And they kind of get on Hamlet's case because he is still in mourning. They've moved on, obviously. And they're telling him, why is it so special for you? Like, people die. Get over it. Everyone loses a father sooner or later. And Hamlet is, he can't speak what's inside him. He says, I have that within that passes show. I can't show it. In this Denmark, it's almost like an authoritarian police state. Nobody can really express their inmost feelings. Everybody is spying on each other. As the action goes on, even Ophelia becomes a willing instrument of Claudius's spying and Gertrude's spying on Hamlet. We get this, Hamlet can only speak in soliloquies and asides. And he's also, but we understand why he's feeling so perturbed, because he's learned things that nobody else seems to know. When Claudius calls him kinsman, cousin, which means kinsman, Hamlet says, it's a little bit of an aside, a little more than kin and less than kind. Well, this kind of brings me to one other thing I wanted to point out, which is that some words' meanings have changed since Shakespeare's time. I'm sure Jim Hale pointed a few of them out to you in his talk. But I wanted to actually kind of point these out. Mere and merely, for example, don't mean what they meant in Shakespeare's time. When we say, if we hear all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, we think, oh yeah, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are just players. But that isn't what it means in Shakespeare's time. It means that all the men and women are utterly, totally players. Kind of puts a different spin on things. Similarly with kind. It was, I think in Shakespeare's time, the word was beginning to acquire our modern sense of being nice. But mainly, its primary meaning is to be of a kind, to like birds of a feather, or humankind, to belong together, which is a natural state of affairs. To call someone unkind is to call them unnatural. So when Hamlet says a little more than kin and less than kind, he's saying, well, okay, I'm a little bit more than just a kinsman to you, because like you're my uncle and sort of my stepfather, but you're not natural. This isn't natural. It's less than kind. So, which I think is kind of interesting. Of course, if you called someone natural, it meant they were a fool or a simpleton. So you can't say, you wouldn't say someone was behaving naturally in the same sense that we would say it anymore. So, okay. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. Hamlet's been like psychoanalyzed, I think, by critics, ever since probably the play has been written. And a lot of critics have felt that Hamlet is sort of modern. He lives in his head a lot. He thinks a lot. But he himself berates himself for his inability to act. He seems almost paralyzed with doubts. He needs proof. Again, he wants proof that what he heard from the ghost is true. Before he can take action. I mean, you're not going to just go killing somebody just because a ghost told you to, right? You have to make sure that there was real truth there. But I just wanted to point out that actually there's parallels. For a while in 19th century Russia, there was such a thing as Russian Hamletism. And this had to do with the fact that the Russian intelligentsia were pretty much paralyzed in their relationship vis-a-vis the Tsars. Russia was always an authoritarian state. It was authoritarian under the Tsars. And the intellectual class was chafed under this authoritarianism, and yet they felt powerless to do anything. And so they accuse each other of Russian Hamletism, not being able to take action. But Hamlet, does eventually hit upon this theme when the players, bless you, when the players show up. the troupe of actors shows up, he hits upon the scheme of having them perform the murder of Gonzago, which pretty much enacts what Claudius has done. And in this sense, he, I think that's an action. You know, he thought of it and he kind of pulls it off. So the actors do that. The other thing Hamlet is able to do is to feign madness. He pretends that he's losing his mind. And of course, there has been much discussion among critics as to whether Hamlet is really pretending or whether he actually has lost his mind. And I don't come down one way or another in this, on this question. The other thing is with Ophelia, he really pretends to be crazy with Ophelia. His encounters with her are bizarre, to say the least. But get thee to a nunnery is the famous line when he dismisses her. He says, I did love you once. So we're left to wonder, well, what is their relationship? Did they have, we know he must have courted her. She has letters from him. She tells him, these are things you told me. Her father, of course, counsels her not to pay any attention to what he tells her. In fact, he tells her to return all the letters. Hamlet is above her. He's a prince. Even if he loves her, he won't necessarily be able to choose the woman he loves. His marriage will be dictated by the state. So poor Ophelia is left to... she's actually an embodiment of the ideal Renaissance woman, which I know a lot of people have lofty ideas about the Renaissance, but I regret to say that the ideal woman during the Renaissance was chaste, silent, and obedient. And poor Ophelia seems to fit that description quite a bit, or at least on the surface she does. But a lot of Shakespeare's heroines actually defy that stereotype, but Ophelia, she listens to her father, she listens to her brother, she does what people tell her to do, and finally loses her mind. And but Hamlet's speeches to her are rude and full of innuendo where we see them. I'm sure that a lot of you know that to die is Renaissance slang for having an orgasm. I'm sure most people have heard this. Nothing is Renaissance era slang for female genitalia, right? Much ado about nothing, for example. And there's an exchange between Hamlet and Ophelia as they're sort of settling down to watch the play, and he asks if he can put his head in her lap. She says no, then she says yes. And he says, did you think I meant country manners? And she says, I think nothing, my lord. Oh, his reply is, well, that's a fair thought to lie between a maid's legs. She says, what, my lord? He says, nothing. Nothing lies between the maid's legs, right? So what's Ophelia to make of this? We don't know. I mean, she appears to be almost naive in her exchanges with Hamlet, but then when she loses her mind, her speech consists of songs and kind of prattle full of innuendos. And the songs are quite bawdy in many places. You go, where did little Ophelia learn this? So she may be a more complex character than meets the eye. That's something to ponder. So we have the play. Within the play happens, there's a dumb show, a mime portion in which the murderer comes out and pours poison into the victim's ears. And what an ingenious way to commit a murder. But and then of course there's the play in which the murder happens. And Claudius, this is meant to entrap Claudius. Horatio and Hamlet are closely watching Claudius to see how he will react to this. And of course, he abruptly stands up in the middle of it and cuts it off. So that's proof of his guilt. In fact, he leaves the play. In the next scene, he attempts to pray, and he actually confesses that he is the murderer. And Hamlet sneaks up on him, but he misses the part where Claudius admits that he can't pray. Hamlet doesn't want to kill him while he's praying, because if he does so, he'll go to heaven, because he's been purging his soul. And Hamlet, that's not real revenge. so Hamlet doesn't want, he says, I'll wait for another occasion. So he doesn't murder him there. But as it turns out, Claudius is unable to pray. I'm going to kind of digress here a little bit again into Russian relations with Hamlet. Hamlet was translated in Russia in the 18th century, but those translations were actually based on French translations. Laplace, who kind of actually paraphrased a lot of Shakespeare plays, and his version of Hamlet was not even meant to be performed, but the first Russian translation is based on it. And then later Jussy translated Shakespeare into Russian. By the time you get to the 19th century, both Pushkin and Lermontov, who are major Russian poets, in fact, Pushkin is Russia's version of Shakespeare. They were reading Shakespeare in English, but Hamlet could not be staged, for example, in Stalin's Russia. The great director Vsevolod Meyerhold could not stage Hamlet as long as Stalin was alive, because probably because there are so many echoes of an oppressive totalitarian state in Hamlet's Denmark. Pushkin, Russia's equivalent of Shakespeare, of the great poet, was killed in a duel. And the elegy that was written for him by Lermontov, who was the other great poet killed in a duel. Yeah, what a waste. Actually echoed these lines from Claudius's attempted prayer, where Claudius says, "In the corrupted currents of this world, offense's gilded hand may shove by justice, and oft 'tis seen the wicked prize itself buys out the law. But 'tis not so above. There is no shuffling. There the action lies in his true nature." So unpacking that, what he's actually saying is, in this corrupt world, you can buy off justice. And oftentimes you buy off justice with the money you made from your crime. But in heaven, this isn't the case. In heaven, you have to answer for yourself. This was considered extremely subversive under Tsar Nicholas I, when Lermontov was writing these lines. So, in fact, I think Hamlet is considered subversive in almost every oppressive totalitarian society you can think of. So Hamlet misses his opportunity here. Okay. Onward. Oopsie. Hamlet's relationship with his mother. Freud made a lot of this. If you look at Freudian theory and Oedipus complexes and things, you can kind of see how it fits. It's interesting in terms of if you look at women in Shakespeare's time, Gertrude never really explains why did she marry Claudius so quickly. Hamlet, when he goes to talk to her, and incidentally kills Polonius, who's hiding behind the curtain while he's talking to her. He shows her apparently two portraits, one of his father and one of his uncle, and says, "How can you even compare these two guys? They're not even close. You went from one hastily went from one bed to the other. What's wrong with you?" It's interesting that in Shakespeare's day, the only time a woman had any control over her own property was as a widow. Because when you were a child, in your minor years, or before you were married, actually you could be married as a minor, but your father controlled your property. Then you had a dowry, you got married, your husband controlled your property. Legally, your husband could squander your property. You had nothing to say about it. The only time you controlled your own property as a female under the law, this was legal, was as a widow if your children were minors and you had no son over 21, because in that case he controlled the property. But you get a lot of jokes, it happens in Taming of the Shrew, for example, about young men marrying widows. Well, yeah, they wanted to marry the widows. Widows had property. And also in Shakespeare's time, the oldest brother inherited property and the younger ones legally could not. So if you were a younger brother, you had to make your fortune somehow, and one way was to marry a widow. But of course, Claudius is not in this position, apparently. It's just kind of interesting. Gertrude, people say, okay, this takes place in Denmark, but it really takes place in England, right? All Shakespeare's plays are really about England. They can't help but be. Gertrude probably doesn't have the agency that Hamlet wants her to have. When he says, oh, just don't go to bed with him. I can't help but wonder how simple that might have been. Of course, she thinks he's insane. The ghost shows up in the middle of his interview with his mother, and she doesn't see it, only Hamlet. So that doesn't help his case. She's convinced that he's mad. So, of course, what happens is Hamlet gets sent off to England with his old school day companions, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who have turned spy. They've become spies for the king, basically. And Hamlet discovers, he tells us later, he tells us in a letter to Horatio that he has discovered that they have papers ordering his execution upon arrival in England. But Hamlet, because he discovers this, and he cleverly forges a different paper that has them executed, and he happens to have a seal that was his father's, and so he puts the seal, makes it official. And so, of course, and then, of course, they're attacked by pirates, but Hamlet is the only one taken prisoner. So he gets taken prisoner on the pirate ship. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern get to England, and then we get a report later that they are dead. And then, of course, there's a famous play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is a line out of Hamlet. So, Hamlet returns to Denmark. And meanwhile, Ophelia has gone mad. Her father has been murdered by Hamlet. Her brother returns from France, where he's been a student. Ophelia, again, this is the iconic painting of Olivia by John Everett Millais. This is a pre-Raphaelite, 19th century depiction. All the pre-Raphaelite women look like that, even when they're not dead. they're sort of pale and interesting and look like the slightest gust of wind will blow them over. But of course, she has famously plucked all the flowers, and she gives you, here's rosemary for remembrance, and then rue, and all these flowers, and phallic long purple flowers, and things like that. It's interesting that there's been a long association of women with madness. This goes back a very long way. It's also interesting that over the centuries, portrayals of Ophelia by actresses, famous or not, have tended to reflect the prevailing opinion of the times as to the connection between women and madness. So in the 18th century, actresses playing Ophelia tended to be very restrained, and because there was this piety associated with it. You didn't go crazy on stage. It was sort of the neoclassical period. Then in the 19th century, you had more of the unhinged, hysterical Ophelias. And then in the, I think it was 1878, the famous actress Ellen Terry portrayed Ophelia for the first time as kind of a complete character, which was very unconventional for her time anyway, Ellen Terry. And she actually wanted to wear black. Ophelia wears white. She's described as wearing white. And Ellen Terry wanted her character to wear black, and the director said, no, only one person on stage can wear black, and that's Hamlet. So she didn't get to, but it was a groundbreaking performance. And of course, since then there have been Freudian interpretations and others. But Ophelia is, and she's become a kind of a, if you say Ophelia, she means more than just the character. And in Shakespeare, she often means any young woman. Somebody wrote a book on anorexia, I think back in the 90s, called Saving Ophelia or something. So, I mean, anyway, interesting. The afterlives of Shakespeare's plays. Alas, poor Yorick. So this actually begins as a comic scene, right, with the grave diggers. They're exchanging jokes and tossing skulls aside as they come across them. Somehow the gravedigger recognizes one as Yorick, as Hamlet and Horatio come walking along. It's interesting because, well, my theory is the reason Shakespeare's plays, unlike those of many of his contemporaries, have really survived very well is that he had no compunction in mixing tragedy and comedy in one play, which violates all the Aristotelian sort of parameters of what a tragedy should be. And actually, he was criticized heavily for this, especially in the 18th century, for mixing these genres. In fact, Alexander Pope, the great English poet who edited Shakespeare, threw out the drunken porter scene from Macbeth. It's the only comic relief in Macbeth, I think, unless the dialogue with Lady Macduff and her son counts. But anyway, but it was thrown out because it was indecorous. It shouldn't be there. So they had problems with the grave-diggers too. But anyway, the alas, poor Yorick is also an emblematic line out of Hamlet. Hamlet seems to have. It almost seems like he's more at peace with himself when he comes back from his voyage and being captured by pirates and all that. I wish we had scenes from that, but we don't. He's, he addresses the skull. I mean, of course, who knows whether it's Yorick or not, but death is the great leveler, right? So sooner or later, everyone comes to that. There's Marxist criticism that really makes much of this particular scene because the gravediggers are talking about the class distinctions. Ophelia's funeral party comes along at this point. The gravediggers are talking about how she apparently committed suicide, although to me it doesn't seem super clear from the descriptions that we get of her. She climbed the tree and the branches broke. She fell into the brook. She floated and sang a while, and then she drowned. Well, is that a suicide? Apparently, the only reason she's being buried in a churchyard is because of her station, her high station. That if she had been a commoner, she would have been buried in unhallowed ground because she is considered a suicide. So it's kind of it's interesting. So we're kind of galloping through the play, but finally, this is the dual. I think that's Branagh. This is the. Is it Olivier? Who knows? Oh yeah, they're both kind of blonde. Yeah, or whatever. Anyway, this was the best sort of picture I got. Laertes returns, of course, and he's incensed. His father was murdered by Hamlet. He never got a proper burial. They buried him as hastily as they got married after the death of Hamlet's father. now his sister has died. Claudius talks him into setting a trap for Hamlet. So now Laertes becomes the revenger. It's kind of a mini revenge tragedy within the whole play of Shakespeare. Hamlet. And what I wanted to say is Shakespeare often does this. He didn't invent the plot of Hamlet. It was available. There had been previous plays written with this about Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. There was a play that is now lost by Thomas Kyd, and we know it existed because it's alluded to. Kyd wrote probably the quintessential revenge tragedy, the Spanish tragedy, which is even bloodier than this. But what Shakespeare does with one of the things he's doing with his inherited plot is he's setting that little mini revenge tragedy within the revenge tragedy. So you have Laertes, who also is not he's not of a high station. He's in a situation that's not of his making. He is setting a trap for Hamlet. The sword is poisoned. So is the cup of wine. And of course it backfires and the swords are exchanged. Laertes is wounded with his own poisoned sword, but of course Hamlet is also wounded with the same poisoned sword. Gertrude drinks the wine that's intended for Hamlet. Everybody dies. That's more or less the end of the play. We have the very famous last line, the rest is silence. It's interesting because Hamlet, the play, is kind of, if you think about it, is full of unfinished stories, interrupted stories, or stories maybe that can't even be told. We have, in the very first act, you have the Bernardo, the watcher on the ramparts, is talking about how the ghost appeared, and that story's interrupted. We have the first player when the players show up, and Hamlet asks the player to recite from the Aeneas's tale of Dido, which the player recites with tears in his eyes and leads Hamlet to berate himself for not being able to feel emotion for a real death, as the way the player can for some what's Hecuba to him or he to Hecuba, and yet he is talking about a death with tears in his eyes, and it's an imaginary death. It's not even real. But that is interrupted. The play is interrupted very violently when the king rises. All of a sudden, it's cut off. In the end, Hamlet's words are cut off. Hamlet dominates this play. He's the one he's got more lines than any of Shakespeare's characters, any of them. I think Richard III is second. But then he asks Horatio to tell his story. But when Fortinbras shows up with his Norwegian army, all Horatio can do is kind of give a bald summary that doesn't really do justice to all the subtleties and the innuendos and the turmoil. It's just a synopsis. And then, of course, Fortinbras orders Hamlet to be buried with full military pomp and circumstance, in a sense, possibly maybe recognizing a fellow soldier in some sense. So Hamlet gets that hero's end at the end. But again, the play leaves a lot of things unanswered. And that is the end of my presentation, but if anybody has questions or comments, I am happy to attempt to answer them.
I had a question about one of the slides. Was that Edwin Booth? One of the slides of Hamlet. I thought it was Booth. I wasn't sure.
I don't know, because I went through and picked the large ones. That would.
So you don't know if that was Claire Bloom and Rod Steiger?
That is Richard Burton and Claire Bloom.
Richard Burton and Claire Bloom. Oh, okay.
Very young. That one I actually saw, yeah.
I think the one before.
And the one before.
Yeah, that's.
That my, oh, okay. Yeah, that's, I love that. That's so like,
Yeah.
that's, yeah. So,
I have a question from
yes.
Haynes. What is, Professor, what is your favorite depiction of the play, either in movie or otherwise?
Oh my gosh. That's a really tough question. Because it's interesting because I've heard people discussing this, and I think the Olivier one is sort of the iconic one perhaps, but there's a lot cut from that version. And then I know the brand. I think directors make it because they want to be in it, And I think there's the Branagh version, and then there's. I'm sorry, but I almost can't answer that. I've seen plays performed that I've really liked, and yeah, but I don't know if anyone else here has a favorite.
You actually have a picture of my favorite version, which is the.
Oh yes, the Tenet.
David Tennant.
This one. Yeah.
Yeah, he's famous for Doctor Who.
Right, Doctor Who.
But he's an excellent that way.
That's so. Yeah, Doctor Who. That's a good reason to like that. Doctor Who. But no, seriously, I'm not being facetious. I like. What's that?
Who were the two in the very last slide?
Oops. Does anyone recognize that?
Is it Sean?
Oh, is it Sean Penn? Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. I was lax and.
The ratio looks like Elton John.
Anybody can play Hamlet.
It looks like Tony Shalhoub.
No.
Mr. Minion and
Oh my God.
he was Monk.
It's fun. There's.
I saw Derek Jacobi doing it at the Royal Shakespeare
Oh my God.
in I think that was 1978, and he had orange hair and they dressed him in gray.
Oh wow.
Black. He was stupendous. It was amazing.
There's so many versions. Shakespeare, the plays lend themselves so well. You can transpose time periods. You can, it's been done so many different ways. It's really hard. I don't know that I personally have one. It's always kind of a treat.
Well, I was wondering why you think this is one of the most enduring plays, one of the most performed, one of the most popular. Maybe because it appeals to our modern sensibilities about the psychological wrong.
That's a good question because I think Hamlet is considered overall the most popular of Shakespeare's plays as far as how often it's staged, in how many places. It's been translated probably into pretty much every language you can think of. But I think it's partly because of the complex psychology of it. There's so much going on. I think the unanswered questions that hang over it lend themselves to different time periods supplying answers or supplying potential possible answers to them that might be. Also, the speeches are really good. They're fun to do. It's a fun. A lot of Shakespeare is a lot of fun once you kind of get past the old language. It's really fun to do them. But yeah, it's yes.
Have you performed in Shakespeare plays?
Only reading. I teach Shakespeare a lot, and I have my students. There's always small group performances in my classes. I ask students to they sign up in advance and they present a scene from a play, and I think I participated in the last. Nell was in one of my classes, and they decided to do that very last scene where everybody dies. And of course, there weren't enough of them, so the class had to participate, and I think I was Laertes. I think that was the only time.
Ketchup packets
Yes, I had the Gertrude, my student who played Gertrude, actually had sneaked a ketchup packet from the cafeteria and bit down on it when she died. So it made a stain in the rug, which I think may still be there.
Here's a question from Haynes.
Yes. Uh-huh.
The first line, "Who's there," sometimes is argued as setting the tone for a question of identity in Hamlet. And you talked about who's there as referring to simply darkness, lack of lighting. How many ways can you twist that opening line for interpretation?
Well, I think I think they're both there. Actually, it's true. The who's there sets the tone, and apart from telling the audience that it's supposed to be night, it also sets that tone of that uncertainty that hangs when Hamlet says Denmark is a prison. It's full of spies. Everybody, that word seeming that comes up, when Gertrude says why she asks Hamlet why his mourning for his father seems so particular to him, and he says seems. It doesn't seem, it is, because seeming is another loaded Renaissance word. There was a lot of anxiety about the fact that that people and events and things could seem to be something other than they are. And there's a lot of, in fact, anti-theatrical prejudice that kind of fits into that anxiety. There was a lot of anxiety that somebody like a poor itinerant actor could portray a king, for example. There was real anxiety that when an actor took on a role, in a way they became that role. And so if something happened to you, you were, in a way, you're forfeiting your soul, because you were not being true to what your creator made you. For that reason, the first actor who played Marlowe's Dr. Faustus wore a heavy cross around his neck throughout the whole play, because Faustus actually repudiates God and can't repent at the end and is dragged down to hell. And the actor had a very real concern that his portrayal, and we laugh, and so the actor wore this cross around his neck as kind of a hedge. No, I don't really mean what I'm saying. But yeah, and I think that who's there does set the tone. The suspicion and yeah, not knowing what's really going on. That's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Yes.
That one who's there, by the end of the play, no one is there.
That's right. No one is there by the end except Fortinbras and his army. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Had Shakespeare traveled outside of England, or was all of his settings from reports of others?
Maybe, I don't know if Jim knows something different than I do. Shakespeare's company went traveling during summers, or there were times when the theaters would be shut down because of plague, and the acting companies would go abroad. It's known that they would travel sometimes along the shores of the Baltic as far as Poland, Gdansk, but I don't know if Shakespeare accompanied them. Do you know?
I don't think we know.
I don't think we know. Yeah. So, but that's interesting. But it seems fairly certain that he knew people who had traveled, I'm sure. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, he may have known people who traveled, but did he really make it very many accommodations? You were saying before that it's more like England in terms of
Yeah, that's right. Right, and I think, right.
He didn't know geography very well.
Well, no. A lot of people, we forget. I often tell my students, you think students tend to approach some of these texts with trepidation, and I say, you have to remember that you are way more educated than the average playgoer in Shakespeare's time. And most of them were illiterate. Most of them didn't know anything. And sure, yeah, they knew the slang, that helped, but and we have to look at footnotes and glosses. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Could they understand what was going on the stage quite well? And for us, it's a challenge.
It is, and I think that's why there's a lot of, Shakespeare wrote a lot of comedy into his plays and a lot of buffoonery, for which he got criticized later. But remember, he was a joint stock owner in the theater where they performed, and it was in his interest to attract big audiences, and so he wrote for a very broad audience, and I think that's probably why he survived so well. That's my personal theory. But he wrote for everybody. So maybe they didn't get the high-flown soliloquies, but they got the gravedigger part. So, yeah. Yes.
Oh, who was the monarch when Shakespeare was writing?
Well, Queen Elizabeth the First, when he was born and during the first part of his career. And he was in the Lord Chamberlain's Players, which was under the auspices of the crown. Elizabeth, it has to be remembered that her and then King James the First, 6th of Scotland, 1st of England, took the throne when she died in 1603. Shakespeare finished his career in the King's Men Players under King James, but we forget, and people aren't aware of what under Elizabeth it was a surveillance state. There's a famous portrait of her wearing a gown embroidered with eyes and ears, because she had the crown had spies everywhere. And there's heavy censorship in Shakespeare's time, which is another thing we don't often realize, that he and his fellow playwrights labored under very heavy censorship.
Well, and propaganda, Richard III was propaganda.
That's right. Thomas More propagandized Richard III early in the century, and then Shakespeare based. But Shakespeare, is familiar. Macbeth, for example, Shakespeare splits the difference between Holinshed's Chronicles and which are kind of, and then the actual. So Macbeth is elected, and and then there's also a hereditary passing of the crown to Malcolm, because the English were doing their best to stamp out elections in Ireland and Scotland. And Shakespeare, he had to watch himself when he was writing. Yeah. So, any other questions, or are we done? Yes.
So did all the rabble that used to attend the plays, did they understand all that highfalutin Shakespeare language?
Well, I think it was sort of their language, but maybe the content might have escaped some of them. I don't know. Like I said, they understood the gravedigger part and the players and things like that. And maybe some things went over their head. But then, of course, when you have actors with gestures and facial expressions and things, that helps. So, yeah.
It must have spoken to them somehow, because it's continued to be popular.
That's right. Yeah. So
Can you talk more about the staging in Shakespeare's time? You mentioned the lighting was so different.
It was an open stage. It was, again, in broad daylight. We know because of things that are mentioned in plays or some stage directions, there aren't a lot of them. There were usually 2 doors. There's one extant drawing of the Globe stage that survives. The stage had like a roof over it, so if it was raining, they could still go, and which was called the Heavens. It had paintings of the stars and sun and moon and things like that. There was an under the stage. You could go below stage. The ghost speaks from under the stage. In a couple of places in Hamlet. You had trapdoors, because, when Faustus gets dragged down to hell, it's through a trapdoor. But that was probably an interior theater. There's like a balcony, Juliet has to appear on a balcony. So we know that. The props, they had props. There were probably things like swords and things like that. Not anywhere near as much as you get later on when you get the kind of the box stage with footlights in the 19th century and very realistic sets, and you have the missing fourth wall. It's like you're looking in to a very realistic setting. You don't have anything like that. So the audience has to use their imagination a lot in these, much more so than later. Then of course Bertolt Brecht comes along in the 20th century and things go back to sort of being more minimalist. But yeah, so.
They had costumes.
They had costumes, definitely had costumes. And of course, remember, all the female parts are played by boys in Shakespeare's time. And that's probably the straightforward reason for why tend to be fewer female parts in most of the plays. Shakespeare plays with that. As You Like It, which is being read next week, Monday, I believe, ends with the boy who has played Rosalind addressing the audience and actually fooling around with the fact that this is a boy talking to the audience, a boy dressed as a girl talking to the audience. So it's really hard to know to what extent audiences were able to forget that these were really boys. I don't know. So,
Maybe if they were pretty enough.
Pardon?
I said maybe if the boys were pretty enough.
That's right. Well, there's been a lot of critics have really delved into this question. Were the boys, was it an erotic thing to watch a boy playing a girl? Was it did women find them attractive? It's interesting, So, but after the Restoration, of course, women were on the stage in England again. So, any other questions or comments? We're done, and thank you all for coming.